Welcome. Welcome to lecture 2.2. We're going to be expanding on some topics we kind of covered in 2.1, specifically around importing and working with multiple files. The best kind of summary description I can give you of what we're about to touch on for the next 30 minutes is that most software projects involve working across multiple files, right? Last lecture was really about how do we work across multiple pieces of code that include ones from the internet that we want to pull down and use. This one is a lot more focused on how do we work with software where we have written multiple files, where we are going in and, updating, like adding 2 or 3 or 4 files instead of just one. Because, that's kind of what we did a lot. That's what we've been doing a lot for the last days. We've just been like writing a file and running a file. Now, again, we'll rely on our C knowledge a bit, but we'll be firstly talking about importing libraries and different ways of importing libraries, as well as our own files. And they all follow the same kind of principles. We actually touched on this a little bit in 2.1 when we imported isValid, but we kind of glossed over it because there's a lot to unpack here that we want to unpack together. So firstly, importing libraries. Similar to C, JavaScript has a bunch of built-in libraries. And what that means is that that's a typo. Damn it. Interpret. No. So Node.js, just like C, has a bunch of built-in libraries, right? And these libraries come with the interpreter, and they don't need to be installed. This is like studio.h. If you install like GCC and C on your computer, you don't need to go and install the like studio.h add-on. It's just like built into the language. And similarly with JavaScript, there are actually some libraries that are built into JavaScript as well, right? And an example of both of these is here in C. We have studio.h, and in JavaScript, we have this one library called file system. Now, you'll notice that the way they're imported between the languages is a bit different. That's just because they're different languages. And in JavaScript, when we want to import this file system library, we say we want to import a file, an object, a thing from some library called file system. Now, the way we import in these languages is also quite different. In C, when you import like a hash include, there's no notion of namespacing or scoping, which are two probably very big words for some of you in terms of like never heard them before. But what that essentially means is that when you include studio.h, you're just kind of copying and pasting everything from that library in the code as if it's always been there. And that's why you don't have to do anything with printf. Like you don't declare printf. It's just there because it's in this. Whereas in JavaScript, it's a lot more like many other languages, most other languages I've seen, where you are importing from path. So path here in the quotes is the equivalent of studio.h. But from path, you are importing a variable called path, which has like all the stuff in it. It's like the object with all the goods in it. It is the thing that you want. And we can have simple programs like this here, where I can import path from path, and I can call this function path.resolve with a ./ and I can run it. And here's the interesting thing, right? We just had this whole big lecture about NPM. But if I make a file called p, and I paste that in here, and then I run node p.js, it actually runs. And what path.resolve does is it actually tells me what the full path of something is, as in what the full file path is, with respect to what I wrote. So // means this folder. So therefore it was like, here is on the CSE account what the full address is. And if I did this on my personal account, I make, p.js and I paste it here. I don't know why import. Actually, I noticed this. Import comes up as yellow on my computer, which was really confusing for me on the weekend because, I couldn't figure out why I couldn't see that, but it's there. So if I run p.js now, it gives me a different path because I'm on a different system. But you'll notice I didn't have to npm install anything. I don't even need npm to run that, and that is because These modules are part of the JavaScript built-ins, and these are all of the libraries that are basically cooked into JavaScript that you don't need to install from the internet. Everything else you need to install from the internet. And most of these you're never going to use. The only interesting ones that I've seen used much are FS, OS, Path. A few others I've used sometimes, but I'd say like FS and Path and OS, but in particular FS and Path are massively useful. You'll probably use them a bunch in the course. But these are all built in. And you can go and use these anytime you want and look them up, and there'd be other documentation online as well. But these are built-in functions, built-in libraries, sorry. So that's just some background there. There's a good question here. Farway says, why do the built-in libs need to be imported? Why not make it so that they don't need to be imported? It's a good question. It's kind of like why import them? You know, like, because if you think about it from a really simple point of view, if I have a program like this, and let's just say I console log path, right? And then I run that, and I'm going to get a thing, right? Path is an object. Most libraries give you objects. If I was to somehow just have path built into the language where I didn't have to import it, this would be valid code. And that doesn't make sense, does it? Because someone who's reading that now has to know what path is, even though it's not in the code, right? So someone trying to reason with or understand the code has to look at this and figure out why it's working. Or maybe they like misspelt something. Like, here's an even scarier one. What happens if I, here's one. You know, what if I wrote path equals hello? And then I run this and it gives me the giant object and all my code breaks because it was a typo. Like, if there's a typo like this, your code should break. So the philosophy around like, why is this not just like part of the language, is because like it's the wrong question. It's like, why should it be part of the language? Why does cutting out a line of why is cutting out a line of code worth making code harder to understand, or right, harder to reason with? That's kind of the deeper question here, right? Sometimes though, things like we've seen previously are built in, such as date. We saw this before. I can actually go and create a new date in JavaScript, and it just works, right? I can just console log date, the date, whatever the hell that is, and it just prints something out, right? And yeah, I would argue that's not great language design, because it's like, things are better to be explicit than implicit, right? It's better if things make sense. If I see date and I see it imported somewhere. But to your question about why is it not just, why not make it so they don't need to be imported? It's more that question of why would you kind of undermine a convention of how to program to make something slightly easier, right? And I think that happens more as you write more and more code, as you just kind of realize that being clear is everything, right? And we talk about that a bit more later in the course. I don't quite understand the question, but why aren't the functions just built in themselves? I think that's the same question as Farway's asked, but if I'm wrong, correct me. So, you know, we can import libraries like that. We can use them like this. These are built-ins. It's the same as the last lecture. What's slightly more interesting, though, is importing our own files. So I'm actually going to go and look at some of my code over here. So inside, a lot of the code from today is inside this env1 folder I have, and I know it's a bit small here on the editor, but there's actually a couple of files of interest. So this one here, splitbefore.js, you can see I've got this function called manyString. And what manyString does is that it basically takes in a number, which is how often to repeat a string, and it takes in a string, and then with some loops and stuff, it goes and like copies that string a bunch of times, then it prints it out. And I can run this file if I want to. So I can go and run 2.2 split before. So I'm going to go and navigate into my env1 source folder where all my code is, and I'm going to run 2.2 split before. There's a lot of code in this folder. And it runs, right? Because what is the code trying to do? It's trying to print hello 5 times, so it prints hello, 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 like that. So that's all fine. Nice little cute piece of JavaScript, right? Pretty straightforward. And if we want to use that file that we've written somewhere else, right? So like we have this many string function here. If I want to use that function in another file, then I need to be able to import that into another file. And the other file that wants to import that is going to be here. And, oops. Yeah, so it's like over here. And just like we saw with the built-ins, what we do is that we basically say we go and get the file we want to import from, and then we import it as some kind of object, like many string here, and then we use it. Now, if I make this slightly bigger, one other thing we have to do is you would have seen in the first split before thing, we just console logged it here. The way JavaScript works is that you can't just import anything from any file. A file has to kind of make itself available. You know, it's a two-way street. So a file A needs to import file B, something from file B, but file B also needs to kind of export something to file A. So this console log here doesn't work. We need something more like this. And what we end up with is essentially, let me make this a bit further down. Oops, that's not it. Yeah, that'll do. This is kind of what we end up with, where we have a file on the left here, which has a function. Oops, sorry, opened the wrong file. We have a file over here, which is a function, and what we do is we say we would like to export default as just a keyword in the language. Just roll with it for the moment. And what this says is that this file is going to export this thing, right? And I'm going to export many string, that one single thing. And then this file over here is like, hey, in that file 2.2 split after lib, I would like to import the thing that it is exporting called many string, and then I'm going to use that like this. And then what you'll see is that these programs work, where the program on the right will actually use what the program on the left has. So if I run 2.2 split after main like this, it actually imports it from, keep whacking things, it imports it from one file into another. That's super duper 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 useful, right? Makes sense. And the keyword of interest to us here is export default. And export default is used when we want to export. saw the random dependency tree. When we want to export one thing from a file, right? Pretty straightforward. You can see the lines there of interest to us, which is the export and the import. Again, you need to import the thing to use it, and you also need to export the thing to have it be used. So that kind of relationship is important. Without that export, like let's get rid of it, it'll basically say that it can't find it when it tries to import it. It'll be like, nope, tried to import it, couldn't find it. Like that. It'll be like, the requested module, this is in file, does not provide an export name default. It's basically like, I can't find what you're looking for. So that's quite important. The question then arises though, what if I want to export multiple things? What if I want to export a couple of functions? Okay, so now we need a slightly different approach. So let's say that we have a file like this one, where we've got a many string function, and we've also got an add brackets function, like this. And the add brackets function simply takes in a string and it returns that string with parentheses around the outside. I probably should have called it add parentheses. But what we just learned before is that if we want to export something from one file to make it available in the other, it's not possible because we can only export one thing here, which is the export default many string. So the way around that is that if we don't include the default keyword, we can actually return a kind of set of different functions or objects or anything we want. So in this case, I'm like, all right, two functions. I want to export both of them. I want to export the many string function. I want to export the add brackets function. And both of those can be exported for whoever wants to use them. And then therefore, when I use them, I import them like this. And I'll bring this up on the screen so it's a little bit bigger, which is that I import them with the brackets as well. It's all very straightforward because thankfully, you have brackets on one and you have brackets on the other. Just trying to remember how to get rows. Shift Alt 8. Okay. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. Yeah, so you have a situation like this now. I want to make this different spot. Come on, come on. Yeah. So now you are essentially exporting two functions and you're importing them like this. So brackets and many string. And then similar to, braces in one, braces in the other. So that's how you export multiple things like that. This is also a process that we sometimes call destructuring, where, you kind of hand out a thing that contains many things and you kind of pull each of those things out. We'll talk about that more as we go through the course, but short summary is there's the simple way to import like this with the one thing, and then there's the double way like this. Let's compare the two methods. So on the left we have our default export, which is the keyword export default A, which in this case exports the function A. And then over here we have two functions A and B, and we export A and B, and then we import A and B. Pretty straightforward generalized summary of things. However, whilst these two things seem the same, there is a subtle difference between them that we need to think about. And that encourages us to generally use named exports. Named exports are the multiple one, right? So named exports is just when we say export like this. Default exports are when we don't. Named exports have two benefits. One is the obvious, which is that it allows flexibility in our code design because it allows us to add more exports later. So if you write a file that has a useful function in it and you think, you know what, this file's only ever going to have one useful function in it, sometimes it's good to, not always, but like sometimes it's good to write it as a named export because it allows someone else to come along down the line and to essentially add another function to it without having to go and change that code and everywhere it's used. That was probably somewhat obvious to you, I would guess, many of you. The second one that's a little less obvious unless you know the language is that a default export is allowed to use a different name. So the example that you see here is a default export at the bottom where I have a function called sum and then I export the sum function. Right? So that's how it is. But when you're default exporting, importing, like over here, the name of the import actually doesn't matter. It's actually totally irrelevant, which makes sense because it's like, doesn't matter what the name is, the program can figure out what you're importing because there's one thing to import. And that can, like, you could argue that might be good in some instances, but in general, it can leave for some strange room because, if someone is importing the isValid function from, the date functions library, let them import it. Don't change the name, right? Like if you're a programmer and you come across this function here and someone tried to import isValidDate, you'd be like, what the hell is it? I've never seen that before. Whereas if you see isValid, you're like, oh, I've been a software engineer in JavaScript for a year, so I have seen that before, so I know what it means. I understand the meaning of that word. I don't have to go and reinterpret it. The benefit of named exports in a way is that if you just try and do this, if I just go back to our previous example, it will simply break like this. Break function date like that. Not wrong thing. Yep, it'll break. It'll be like, sorry, that doesn't exist. Whereas if that was a default export, then it would not break, which is, part of the problem. The other thing is that whilst generally named exports are good for that reason, the catch with the named exports though, right, is that what if you do want to rename it? Because sometimes it actually does happen. Sometimes you actually have code where you have already got a function called isValid, and that might be checking if you're a valid course admin. Like this. And this function simply returns, it's like, if course admin name equals Rennie, or if it equals Tam, or it equals Juliana, then, return true, else return false. So let's say you have a situation like that. Well, you can actually use an alias here by saying, I want to import isValid as date functions is valid. Something really clear like that, and then you can go and use that, and now your code will still work, but you haven't had to like go and rewrite your code like this. By the way, just while we're talking about it, a little bit of a fun tip here. If you would like, you can write this code a little bit simpler. Bit of a fun thing. You can simply, this is a common thing we see all the time. If you just have a condition that's, if it's true, you return true, otherwise you return false, you can just return that condition. A bunch of you probably do that already. That is generally probably considered a way to make your code slightly cleaner, because it's just like return true if that's true, false if it's false. But we can also take that further, because you can look up JavaScript check if element in list, and you Google that and you'll see, you know, oh, I should call it array, sorry, not list. Array will get me better results. 5 ways to check if something. There's a bunch of like new and old versions depending on the JavaScript you have. We have a newer version of JavaScript we're working with in the course, so you can see that for a list like this, you can actually just use .includes. So given a list, an array of items, if you just say, I want to check if it includes an item, it'll just return true or false. So you can actually clean this code up if you want. I can go and write a much shorter version, which is a neat little trick where you write, you put the names in an array. So I'm like creating an array of course admins like this, and then I can say .includes course admin name. So basically, if course admin name is one of the items of this array, then return true. So that's kind of like a simpler way to write a function here if you'd like to. So, you know, suddenly code starts to get a little bit cleaner. We'll continue to talk about little things like this in the course as we go. But the point of that was that you can alias named imports. It's not that named imports can't be. It's just that you have to kind of go out of your way, which is a good thing because it stops you doing silly things. I just touched on this, how you can alias it, so that's all fine. And also, I guess the last thing, we're going to talk about style, like style guides a bit next week in week 3. But in the meantime, just a bit of a hint. If you ever have like a lot of imports you're importing, sometimes you'll be using like 10 functions from a library. So you'll be like import A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, like that. You actually generally break them up across multiple lines. So if you've got a lot of like imports like this is how you'd write the code. That's just a little bit of a tip. So last couple of questions. So what's this question? So if they used a different keyword to export multiple functions to use specific functions, you would have had to write I guess so. I mean, there are ways you can get around the default export thing. It's not ideal because you're then determining it at runtime more than the import level. So it's like your code is slightly more likely to fail. But let's go look at a previous example where we had this. So let's say that you actually wanted to export both. You could technically make like an object, call it like my function object, and that could just be an object that contains 2 functions, which is just many string, like this. So the many string key is many string, and then the add brackets key is add bracket. So it's kind of like a package of functions, and then technically I could kind of default export that package. So it's like I'm packaging them into one thing, and then I'm doing that. And that should work, I think. No. Oh, add brackets. Sorry, that's just a typo. That still works. But the problem with this is that I don't want to say there's a problem. It's better to use named exports because it's much easier to read code when you can see up the top what's being imported. Like this is easier to read than that. It also means that if your code fails, it fails early on whilst JavaScript is trying to pull in all the files. as opposed to when the code's actually running. And the earlier your code fails, generally the better. So that's definitely important. Jeremy says, isn't add bracket and... Yeah, okay, yeah, Jeremy was on top of that. That was just a typo before. Thank you, Jeremy. Jack says, wait, so files and folders are objects in JavaScript too? I don't know what you mean by that. I wouldn't say that files and folders are objects. I mean, we're importing objects from a file. More so. Brennan says, do you always have to specify the specific functions you want to import from a module, or is there a way to import the whole scope into a module? What a wonderful question. So there's this kind of hilarious, to me it's hilarious because everyone does it, me included, where, you kind of, when you start, the sign of you getting more experience as a programmer will generally be when you don't mind things feeling more verbose if they're more clear. And it's usually considered good practice in most circumstances. I don't want to be dogmatic and say always or never, to be explicit about your imports. And what I mean by that is, generally speaking, you would consider this one, even if there was 100 other things here, much better because you are being very declarative about what you are doing. It helps you as a programmer. It can possibly help a linter or a compiler. It might be able to assist with performance, because if the interpreter knows what you're not using or are using, maybe it doesn't need to pull everything. There's a lot of benefit, potentially, technically, potentially in terms of human reading, that comes from being very explicit about what you're doing, rather than just trying to kind of, be a bit more syntactically concise, in terms like, I'll just import it all in this little bucket, and therefore I can just be like all.this, all.that, all.that. But it's kind of not really great, because it kind of all makes sense because you're reading your code by yourself. But when someone else comes along and they look at this and they think, okay, what else does all have or not have? And then they have to kind of go look it up, as opposed to being able to see at the top of the file everything that's being imported. And then they can just see it and follow it and, make sense of it much easier. So I don't want to say there's a right and wrong way, but I would generally say that, this comes from, I believe, the Python guide somewhere in terms of what makes good programming. But the idea of, again, being explicit instead of implicit, and it's much better to overstate what you're doing than to be vague. Yeah. Yash says, if you have a function that relies on another helper function to work, do you need to import both functions? Yash, that's a great question. I don't think I've ever been asked that before, but it makes complete sense. So Yash's question is like, okay, if I have my file up here, the square, with the big smiley face in it, and it's importing another file, and that file is importing a third file, so red needs green, blue needs red. Does blue need to import red and green? The answer is no. The interpreter will go and, like, if you import red, the interpreter knows to look at what red imports and import that and kind of jumble it all together. So there's no need for that. You can just import the one thing you need, and everything behind that is a black box. Thankfully, otherwise I think life would be substantially more difficult. Great. So that actually wraps up tonight. We'll finish 15 minutes early because you're all very nice, and we ran over for the first lecture and I said we would, and you were very patient, so I appreciate that. Tomorrow we'll be talking about testing, really exciting lecture, really critical lecture, and then we'll be talking about working as a team. It's a pretty short lecture just on essentially how to function as a group in preparation for iteration 1. There's a very short... I have an event on, a work event till 6 tomorrow, but I'm leaving early to come lecture. So there's a slight chance I'm late. But if I am late, just to be really clear, I will just update the time here by 15 minutes or something. But that's the worst case. It's probably going to be fine. But if it is, I'll update that. But yeah. So thank you. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and we'll keep chatting tomorrow about dynamic verification, which is testing your code, and how to work together as a team. Yeah, please, obviously, as always, if you could be bothered, fill that in and have a great evening.